Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to talk about follows on from what Greg spoke to us about earlier. And here we applied that to specific dietary interventions to achieve body mass loss. So both the low carbohydrate and the low fat diet are popular among those who desire to reduce their body mass. Another popular approach is personalised nutrition, which tailors strategies to optimise their effectiveness for specific individuals. However, before we can advocate such a personalised approach, it's important to consider whether individuals respond differently to identical dietary interventions, which is termed response heterogeneity. As Greg mentioned earlier, although differences in individual responses might appear to exist in the treatment arm of a randomised controlled trial, it's important to consider the impact of random within subject variation, which is inevitable even with a gold standard protocol. And this can sometimes be so substantial that it explains all the apparent individual response differences. So true response heterogeneity can only be identified through formal statistical comparison of the standard deviation of the change in body mass in the intervention group before and after the trial period, and then comparing this to the same standard deviation in the comparator arm. So when these standard deviations are similar, it indicates that true individual response differences are clinically unimportant. And it's only when these standard deviation between groups are different does this indicate a clinically meaningful inter-individual variation. But this approach has not yet been applied to explore the response heterogeneity between low carbohydrate and low fat diets. And therefore, we conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis to quantify the true inter-individual response variation in the body mass change following low carbohydrate and low fat dietary interventions. So we conducted a literature search to identify randomized control trials, which lasted for a minimum of 3 months, investigating low carbohydrate diets. And we defined that as less than 150 grams per day of carbohydrate, compared to at least one comparator condition. So we identified 25 trials, which included a total of 3,340 participants. These participants were aged 18 or older, inclusive of both sexes, all levels of adiposity, and both healthy and diseased populations. From these studies, we extracted the standard deviation of the body mass change in the low carbohydrate and low fat study arms. For each study, the true individual response variance was quantified as a standard deviation of the change in the body mass in the intervention group minus the control group. Standard error of this variance was then calculated for each study using the degrees of freedom of the standard deviation in the intervention and control groups. The individual response variances and their standard errors for each study were then meta-analysed in a random effects model to give a pooled point estimate for inter-individual variance. Finally, the square root of this value gives us the standard deviation for inter-individual variability in the body mass change, which is the key value that we're interested in here. We also calculated a 95% confidence interval for this response variance. So we found that the standard deviation for inter-individual variability in the body mass change to be 1.4 kilos, with a 95% confidence interval between negative 1.1 to 2.3 kilos. And this is a small response heterogeneity with a wide confidence interval that overlaps 0. This therefore highlights the imprecision of this estimate of inter-individual response variability. This therefore indicates a lack of evidence for the inter-individual response variability that we can directly attribute to the low carbohydrate diets and relative to the inevitable random within subject variability in body mass that naturally will occur over several months. This therefore leads us to conclude that there's currently insufficient evidence to indicate there's any greater or lesser inter-individual variation in the body mass response to low carbohydrate diets relative to the comparable low-fat diets in the trials conducted to date. Lastly, our results indicate that more evidence is needed to support the notion of differences in response heterogeneity between the low carbohydrate and low fat diet. And ideally, we'd have properly powered trials that are designed specifically to compare treatment response heterogeneity between low carbohydrate and low fat diets. So thank you for listening and giving me the opportunity to present, and thank you also to the team involved in this research. Thank you.